Good afternoon, and welcome to the Great Ideas Debate, co-hosted by the Abigail Adams Institute and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. My name is Danilo Petranovic, and I work at the Abigail Adams Institute. Today, I will be your moderator. Abigail Adams Institute is an independent scholarly institute located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our mission is to offer students at Harvard and in the wider greater Boston area access to some of the most important subjects, themes, and arguments that can be found in the big books that define, or perhaps used to define, Western tradition. Before we begin today, I would like to express appreciation, first of all, to our friends at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for partnering with us to put on today's event. Thank you to Diana Davis Spencer Foundation for providing funds for this event. I'd also like to thank Mr. James Davenport of ISI and Mr. James Capuzzi of AAI for their leadership in pulling this event together. And finally, we're deeply grateful to Professors Brooks and Wolff for accepting our invitation. Sometime in the middle of the last decade, we have begun to see consistent data indicating that a striking number of young Americans, and especially young Democrats, say that they are more in favor of socialism than capitalism. What young people mean by socialism, or for that matter, capitalism, seems to be unclear and inexact, but it nevertheless indicates a dissatisfaction with the contemporary state of economic and social affairs. Our purpose today is to dig a little deeper and look behind these almost totemic terms in order to try to better understand the history and philosophy entailed by these isms. Our hope is that our two distinguished interlocutors will help us to get to a more constructive place after these next 90 or so minutes. So, to advance that mission, we have framed the resolution in following terms. Resolved that socialism is preferable to capitalism as an economic system that promotes freedom, equality, and prosperity. The format of the debate is as follows. The first speaker will open for between 15 and 20 minutes. After the second speaker does the same, the first speaker will take no more than 10 minutes to respond and perhaps use this time to pose a direct question to the other speaker. The second speaker will then do the same. We will then go into the second stage of the debate where I will pose select audience questions to the debaters. This will go on for about 30 minutes, and the entire event should last somewhere between 90 and 100 minutes. Students can comment in the chat function that you will see on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A tab, also there. And I promise to do my best to get to the best questions before this is over. I will now briefly introduce our debaters. Arthur C. Brooks is the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School. Before joining the Harvard faculty in July of 2019, he served for 10 years as president of the American Enterprise Institute, a public policy think tank in Washington. Brooks is the author of 11 books, including the national bestsellers Love Your Enemies, The Conservative Heart, and The Road to Freedom. He's a columnist for The Atlantic, host of the podcast The Art of Happiness with Arthur Brooks, and subject of the 2019 documentary film The Pursuit. In full disclosure, Professor Brooks is a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. Richard D. Wolff is professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's currently a visiting professor at the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York City. His recent publications include Contending Economic Theories, Neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian with S. Resnick, and The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That's most recent, 2020. Professor Wolff has also taught economics at Yale University, the City College of the City University of New York, and the Sorbonne in Paris. Professor Wolff's weekly show, Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff, is syndicated on over 70 radio stations nationwide and available for broadcast on Free Speech TV, among other networks. In full disclosure, Professor Wolff is Harvard College, class of 1963. Professor Wolff will go first and will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. And Professor, it's all yours.
First of all, thank you to all who worked on producing this event and inviting me to be part of it. I am flattered and pleased that you are open to this kind of a conversation because we are all aware that for most of the last 75 years, during that period, rightly called the Cold War, this kind of conversation would have been, if not impossible, extremely rare. I'll try to speak quickly. I have a lot of material to cover, and I hope that it will be comprehensive. I've tried to organize my thoughts that way. So let me introduce it. There are three parts: an introduction, the socialist critique of capitalism, and then what it is that the socialists, in my judgment, offer. I obviously take the affirmative position on the resolution as it was read. So here's first the introduction. Every economic system in the history of the world that I'm aware of displays the following form. It is born, it evolves over time, and then it dies or passes away. Tribal economies, feudalism, slavery, whatever you look at, conforms more or less to that pattern, although it sometimes can be repeated at different moments in history. I see no reason whatsoever to imagine that capitalism will not share this basic form. And since I know that capitalism was born, and I know that it has evolved, at least since the 17th century, when it began in England in its modern form, it would seem to me reasonable to assume that the next stage for capitalism is its passing away, and that the logical inference is what we have to talk about is how close to that process we might now be. All systems are also similar in having generated, as far as we can tell, both those who celebrated it and those who criticized it. There's nothing unique or distinctive about capitalism in doing that. From the very beginning of capitalism, whenever you designate its origins, there were the people who loved it and the people who criticized it and didn't like it. People who thought it was the ultimate achievement of the human possibility, and those who were convinced we can and we should do better. Socialism is the most developed critical tradition in relationship to capitalism. It has constantly evolved and developed. It keeps recurring despite horrendous repressions, attacks, dismissals of all kind. It's clear to me that capitalism's flaws and failures are the basic stimulus to which socialism is the response. It's as if socialism were capitalism's shadow. Nothing guarantees the future of socialism so well and so clearly as the continuation, if you like, of capitalism to which it is a response. Capitalism spread from its 17th century origins in England to Western Europe and then eventually to the whole world. So did socialism. It exists now in every country on this planet, in a variety of forms in every country on this planet. In the last 150 years, roughly, that it has been a formal tradition. It demonstrates a spread that few other tendencies or traditions of human thought and practice have achieved. It is, in short, stunning. However, it is also the case that having spread in historically a short amount of time to societies at such different levels of economic, political, and cultural development, that the tradition is diverse and rich. The different cultures have interpreted the ideas of socialism in their own unique ways, reflecting where they were in their own development. The result is that socialism is a complicated tradition, of multiple theories and theoretical movements, sometimes clashing, sometimes together. The most famous and most developed within the socialist tradition is that which takes the name of Marx and Marxism, and it has a parallel history to socialism, and that has to be understood as part of the richness and diversity. The tendency to think of socialism in the singular, as if it were some body of thought that can be reduced to one train of argument, is wrong. It's a kind of simple-mindedness that comes really in our country out of the Cold War. When the bad guys were over there in Russia and we were the good guys, they were bad in their 5 different dimensions, and we were good in those same dimensions. This kind of mentality is now fading, none too soon for most of us, and I hope that's a view shared by others today. Having said all that, let me turn then to number 2, what socialism's critique of capitalism are. And here I'm trying to condense the very different arguments of different groups of people into a few basics so that we can talk in the singular only after I have made clear that it's not the case, that socialism is a family, if you like, a tradition of diverse points of view. So here we go with some of the basics. The critique of capitalism carries the notion that capitalism, in Europe at least, emerges out of feudalism, making some promises. That is, the leaders of the transition out of feudalism, out of the monarchies that were typical of feudalism, particularly in its later centuries, etc., that those leaders, whether they were Robespierre in France or Jefferson in the United States or anyone else you want to pick, they made some promises that the transition from a feudal economic system to a capitalist system would bring, and I'll use the French words, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And the Americans might have been thought to have added democracy. The French and American revolutions were full of affirmations that these wonderful benefits would come with, would be delivered by a transition from a feudal economy, lords and serfs, to a capitalist economy. And the argument of socialism has always been that capitalism failed to deliver on those promises. It never has, and there's no prospect that it will. Number 2, that capitalism has a built-in tendency to produce ever-deepening inequality of income and wealth. The book by Thomas Piketty a few years ago makes this point over and over again, as do the flow of researchers coming from Piketty and Saez out of the University of California and Berkeley and out of Paris. Occasionally, when this inequality goes too far, there are popular revolts against it. Then, temporarily, it can be stopped or even sometimes reversed. But it's only temporary. Once the capitalists regain their position, say after the Great Depression of the 1930s, the inequality resumes deepening, and we have a wonderful example of that in the last 40 years here in the United States. Beyond inequality, capitalism is also, in the socialist view, fundamentally unstable. On the average, every 4 to 7 years, as the National Bureau of Economic Research has shown us, it has a downturn. Some of them are short and shallow, others of them are long and deep. Every 47 years, on average, wherever capitalism has settled, this is the pattern. We have had 3 in the 21st century, the one in 2000, so-called .com, the one in 2008, so-called prime mortgage, subprime mortgage, and now this one. Each one gets a label to distract from the fact that it's built into capitalism, so we call it by whatever happens together with it, as in, for example, the COVID crash. but it is a feature of capitalism that they have tried, the capitalists and their supporters, to overcome, to stop them, to control them. Never has worked. We continue to have them. We're living in one right now. And finally, it's a very undemocratic system. This is perhaps the most important for this audience. And the lack of democracy is located in a particular place, the place that distinguishes capitalism from other systems, the arrangement in production of an employer and an employee. The employer, the owner, the operator, if it's corporate, it's a board of directors, 10 to 15, 20 people. They have the power. They decide what will be produced, how it will be produced, where it will be produced, and what is done with the profits that the work of everybody helped to produce. They are not accountable to the vast majority of the people in an enterprise whom we call employees. It is a fundamentally undemocratic way of organizing factories, offices, and stores. It is the opposite of democracy. The very accountability we take pride in politically has never been introduced into our economic system, and that's capitalism's commitment to an undemocratic organization of its enterprises. Therefore, what has socialism done? Well, socialism has been busy over the last 100 years making experiments, trying in different ways, depending on which tradition within socialism is in a position to do so, to establish what comes next, what happens when capitalism blows itself up. And those experiments are very similar to the experiments made in Italian city-states, in the Low Countries, in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. That transition also took a lot of experiments, some of which didn't work out real well, but they slowly taught people interested in that tradition what to do and what not to do until they finally got it right and capitalism could become the dominant system. And so we have three traditions of socialism to summarize. One, the most moderate one, often called democratic socialism, a la Bernie Sanders or AOC, or in Europe, social democracy. Here we have private capitalist enterprises, but with heavy government controls, taxes, minimum wages, health insurance, free schooling. It's called capitalism with a human face in Europe, where they can have some humor about these subjects. It's Western Europe, it's Scandinavia. The second kind of socialism happened when the socialism I just described split. That was around the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And a group of socialists went off, changed their name, called themselves communists, and took all of this another step. The government wouldn't just regulate private capitalists, it would replace them. Government officials would own and operate enterprises, not all of them, almost never all of them, but more or less important parts of them. And then there were reactions of socialists to these first two experiments, mainly Russia, mainly China. And the reaction was to come up with another kind of socialism, which focused not on the state, arguing that the focus on the state was misplaced, not the proper target, not an important matter, how much is private and how much is state, at least not as important as a different matter, which is dealing with that undemocratic organization of capitalist enterprises. This socialism focuses on the micro level, not the macro level. On the micro level, the argument is simple. Democratize the enterprise. Make the enterprise a democratic location or site in society. Everybody who works in the enterprise, one person, one vote. It's decided democratically by majority vote. What will be produced, what technology will be used, what location for the production will be, and what is done with the net revenues, surplus, or profit. Take your pick. In this perspective, the fundamental flaws of capitalism, its inequality, its instability, are linked and derivative from its undemocratic internal organization. If you have a tiny group of people at the top making all the key decisions, then it isn't surprising that they give to themselves a disproportionate share of whatever the profits or net revenues happen to be. and they become very wealthy relative to the employees, as we certainly can see. And they make their animal spirit decisions about whether to invest or not, facing irreducible uncertainty and the need to guess about the future, focused on profits. And they make profits the bottom line because, of course, they're the ones who get them. And that's what an enterprise should be doing if it's going to serve, first and foremost, those, the minority, who sit at the top. So the socialism of the 21st century, I would argue, is not going to be what it was in the 20th, but rather a new kind of socialism with a focus on the transformation of the enterprise as a learned lesson from what went well and what went not well in the earlier experiments. And I believe that in this country, the growing interest in socialism, to which I will be glad to speak since I'm part of it, is a remarkable testimony to the relevance and to the bright future that this perspective has. I think it will become more and more popular because, in the words of the resolution, it's a better road forward and a way to transition from a declining capitalism to a response to the yearning all good people have to do better in the future than we have been able to do in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wolff, for the opening remarks. Professor Brooks.
Thank you, Danilo, and thank you, Professor Wolff. I've known Professor Wolff's work for a long time, and I want to take the first 30 seconds of my time to recommend his writings to all of you who are watching, for those of you who are not familiar with his work. And the reason is basically this. A lot of people, particularly those who are on the political right, they're used to a sharp and harsh discourse from the political left of late that is based in fear, not in love. Professor Wolff's work is based on love, not in fear. His objective is entirely to lift people up, people who are vulnerable, people at the margins of society, people who do not have power. I think that is incredibly important and in stark contrast to the way that we've undertaken political and economic discourse of late, to build up, not to tear down. So for those of you who are watching, who consider yourselves to be the political left, please emulate the kinds of arguments and the philosophy of Professor Wolff. And for those of you who are on the political right, I'd like you to join me in admiring the way that he argues, and in point of fact, the way that his mind works around these topics. My viewpoints are morally in line with Professor Wolff's, but they are practically very different. So the tenor of my remarks will be based on my answer to the resolution, which is that capitalism is superior to socialism, but it must be based in proper morals. I remember the first time that I saw the face of actual world poverty. I was a child. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, in a lower middle class family. And I saw a picture in the National Geographic magazine in the early 1970s when I was a child of a starving boy in Ethiopia. It was very common at the time. The national and international press was starting to show the images of a horrible famine in East Africa, the worst that anybody had ever imagined, as a matter of fact, although I'm sure there had been worse in history. And the boy had a distended belly and flies on his face, and he was starving, and there was nothing I could do. There was nothing that we thought any of us could do. Those images were haunting to an entire generation of Americans, that and people all over the world of good faith, that there was not just inequality, there was a grinding sense of injustice about what was going on. And there was nothing we could do. Something was wrong with our economy. Something was wrong with our entire system. Well, I grew up with that image. And occasionally I would wonder what happened to that boy as I, went along my own merry way as an American through my 20s. And I was not an economist. I was not paying attention to worldwide economic trends. I was making my living through my 20s as a musician. And if you'd asked me my political point of view, was I closer to socialism or capitalism? I would say most definitely socialism. Most definitely, because it does have a human face. Now, I didn't have the sophistication that Richard just brought to this debate. I mean, I was a French horn player after all, and you hold me to very high economic standards under those circumstances. But it gives you an idea of my ideology. Well, in my late 20s, I still a musician, I happened across a statistic that I could hardly believe, which is that from the time that I had seen that photograph of that boy in Africa until I was about 30 years old, the world population living on $1 a day or less, obviously adjusted for inflation, had decreased by 80%. 4/5 of starvation level poverty had been eliminated in my lifetime, since when I was a little kid until I'd grown up. And I thought to myself, I need to get to the bottom of this. And I started studying economics. I literally changed professions from classical music to economics, from the sublime to the dismal, because of this statistic, what it was revealing to me. Meanwhile, life expectancy had gone up by 15%. Infant mortality had gone down by 60%. Adult literacy had gone up by 23% in my lifetime. What did that? What actually created the miracle that pulled 2 billion of my sisters and brothers around the world out of poverty? And I didn't even know it. By the way, 70% of Americans will tell you today that poverty and hunger has gotten worse in our lifetime. What did it? I went for solutions. And again, my predilection was to find out that it was something like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or some set of institutions that had relieved world poverty on a massive scale. And I looked at the work of economists at the World Bank and economists that I deeply came to admire, like the Spanish economist Xavier Salé Martin, development economists. And they are of a mind that there were 5 forces that did this. 5, and this is the consensus opinion. They are globalization, property rights, the rule of law, free trade, and a culture of free enterprise emanating from the United States and spreading around the world. Now, you might ask yourself, what has this actually done to the rich versus the poor? What has it done about inequality? And the answer is inequality has unambiguously improved over this period. It's true that the rich have gotten richer in raw money income in the United States, especially of late. But around the world, global income inequality has decreased almost every year for 50 years and has plummeted over the past 25 years. This is not a story that you get in the press, but it is in point of fact true that notwithstanding what capitalism has done for the richest people in the world, it has done much, much more for the people at the bottom. My first lesson was that global free enterprise has indisputably been beneficial for the world's poorest people. But it has also had costs. Let's not kid ourselves. There's a town in Kentucky, in Martin County, in eastern Kentucky, called Inez, Kentucky. It's a famous place, not because there's something going on there particularly, but because that's where Lyndon B. Johnson, President Johnson, kicked off his famous war on poverty one day before I was born in 1964. He went to Inez, Kentucky, and he walked up on he was the master of PR. I mean, he put President Obama and President Trump to shame how well he worked with the press. He went up on the porch of a man named Tommy Fletcher, who lived in a tar paper shack, and he said, "I have called for a national war on poverty. Our objective is total victory." Now, this town, Inez, Kentucky, was one of the poorest places in the United States. People were literally starving to death. No running water, no electricity. He came back to Washington, D.C. He put a great American named Sergeant Shriver in charge of the war on poverty, who said, "We are investing in dignity, not doles." You would cheer if you heard this. He was a great man, a patriot. Well, what ensued was the most frustrating war ever. You think that there was a quagmire in Vietnam or Afghanistan. This is the ultimate quagmire. By the time the war on poverty in the United States, which was a wholesale experiment in and greater redistribution of resources and public programs, the poverty rate was about 15%. Today, it's about 14.5%. We've bumped along between 12 and 15% poverty ever since the beginning of the war on poverty, while spending $22 trillion. Poverty is not, under these circumstances of redistribution and collectivism, at least at a limited scale, getting easier to escape. It might be easier to bear, but we do not have dignity instead of doles. We have doles instead of dignity. And these are our brothers and sisters, to which I object actually serving doles instead of dignity. Why did this happen? Why did this happen to Inez, Kentucky? Why is Inez, Kentucky still one of the most desperate places in the United States? Go there today, which I did in the filming of a documentary, and you'll find that 31% of the adults there are in the workforce. Why? Because industries have moved to more economical locations and natural resources and are in cheaper markets. And that is one of the side costs of capitalism that Professor Wolff is rightly talking about, and he's right to talk about it. So what's the fair verdict so far? I'm trying to create a balanced picture here. Let me quote President Barack Obama. In a conversation that I had with him, he said these words to me in 2015 at Georgetown University. Quote, "We don't dispute that the free market is the greatest producer of wealth in history. It has lifted billions of people out of poverty. But there has always been trends in the market in which concentrations of wealth can lead some people being left behind." Now, you may be tempted to say that there's only three options out there. Option number one is starving children in Ethiopia. Option number two is lifting people out of poverty in Ethiopia, but people who are desperate in Inez, Kentucky. Those are the two scenarios we're presented with largely today. Or then there's option number three, which is socialism at a greater level, replacing capitalism. I say there's a fourth path, and I want to present it to you in my last few minutes. A fourth path that keeps our treasured free enterprise system that lifts people out of poverty, but it changes philosophy, it changes policy, and it changes culture. We need a philosophical shift, not just if capitalism is going to survive, but whether or not our culture as we currently know it will survive. See, the problem is since the beginning of the war on poverty, where we've had kind of a corporate socialism, quasi-capitalism in the United States, is that we've gone from needing everyone to helping everybody. What I admire about Richard's position is he's saying we need to need everybody because that's the basis of dignity. Read between the lines of what he said. That's what he was saying. Dignity is what matters. Giving people a voice is what matters to give them dignity. Well, we have gone through the welfare system in this country to one in which certain people are needed and other people are simply maintained, managed, like liabilities. That's how we treat poor people in this country. Can capitalism help make that possible? Government can't, and government won't, is my view, or it would have. Can capitalism make a moral shift like this? Well, if you look back to Adam Smith, he certainly said so. We always remember his Wealth of Nations from 1776, The Invisible Hand. That wasn't his first or best book. In 1759, 17 years earlier, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he talked about a population of people dignified to have markets. And what he basically said was, you can't have markets without morals. We need a system in which we are our brother's keeper, is the bottom line. And we're not doing that. We've forgotten the fact that one of the greatest systems we've been able to create with the largesse of capitalism is finding a way to help our brothers and sisters. We just haven't executed properly because we treat them like liabilities to manage. Second is policy. And this is where I agree with Richard wholeheartedly. He talks about giving every worker a voice. Now, in socialism, that means less ownership by individuals and more by the state. But in my capitalism, it means more ownership. It is absurd that every person in this country, including the person on the line at McDonald's, actually does not have ownership in these corporations. We don't need to contract ownership to the state. We need to expand ownership to all people. Everybody gets equity at all levels. That's more capitalism spread more evenly. The second policy is one of human capital. I mean, isn't it ironic that we're in a country that has the best universities in the world, and at the same time we have a contraction, we have an inequality of human capital and the access to human capital in this country? The reason for this is basic classism. I'm sure Richard shares my view that we're a classist society. We're an elitist society that talks about college for all, when what we should be talking about is developing people as assets. And the way to do that is through skill and training expansion, getting rid of college for all, having a better system of of vocational and technical education and apprenticeships and retraining for people at all levels. That's how to spend public money. And a K-12 system that's not strangled by institutions and syndicalist mentality at the cost of what our kids can learn and what they deserve. And finally, we need cultural changes. We need a culture that remembers that openness is what fertilizes a truly entrepreneurial economy. That's what makes free enterprise great, that valorizes the entrepreneurial act of immigration, that says, please come to our country, please join us. One of self-improvement that says each of us can be the captain of our startup enterprise, which is to say our own lives. Getting back to the culture of openness, immigration, self-improvement, happiness will dispel the three great myths of capitalism, and this is where I'll end. Myth number one, capitalism is good for the rich and bad for the poor. That's wrong. Capitalism is the greatest improvement that has ever accrued to the global poor. Myth number two is that the free enterprise system is an unmitigated improvement for the world. It's also a myth. It's created winners and it's created losers. But myth number three is there's nothing we can do to lower the cost of the free enterprise system, and so we can only replace it, scrap it, get rid of it. That's a myth. There's a lot that we can do with courage and goodwill and unity and with love. And if we start there, we can solve this problem once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brooks, and thank you both for staying within the suggested limits. Professor Wolff, you have 10 minutes to respond to Professor Brooks and perhaps pose a question to him if you wish.
I'm going to take my time to make some responses. They imply questions, and then I'll leave it to Professor Brooks to decide whether to pick up on that or not. I appreciate the goodwill that he articulates. It is important. It certainly makes me more comfortable than I have been on occasion in debates like this. And I want my responses to be understood where I have disagreements. It's not a disagreement based on anything other than appreciation for the tone of these interchanges. So let me begin with this business about raising poverty. Let me offer several considerations before you jump quite to the conclusion that Professor Brooks articulated. First of all, by far the most dramatic experience of the last 40 years in terms of overcoming poverty is the experience of the People's Republic of China, a society that was slow to welcome free enterprise and hedges it about with all manner of limits, controls, et cetera, including keeping a large part of the industrial sector of that country as state enterprises. But it is remarkable to me, and so remarkable to the statistics that are kept about world poverty, that if you take China out of the statistical story, it doesn't look anywhere near as successful as it does when you include them. And this is a society that is not committed morally, politically, or ideologically to free and private enterprise. Number one. Number two, they achieved a level of economic growth not only without a commitment to free capitalism or anything like that. It's also that they grew faster than anybody else, even though they were not on the receiving end of foreign aid from the United States, which was withheld from them for political and ideological Cold War reasons. They have demonstrated the ability to grow their economy in a very dramatic way that is an object of envy on many other parts of the world. Number two, many of the gains that poor people have made, they have had to make with bitter struggles where most of their enemies were capitalists, whether it's the minimum wage or a national health service or anywhere else you look, that poor people in the past and the present try to improve their situations. On the other side is almost always an array of capitalist money and capitalist political power. So much of the gain has really been despite the capitalist system and not quite before it. Over the last 30 years, the average rate of growth of the average real wage in China has been about 4 times. And over the same period of time, the real wage in the United States was stagnant. That is a very dramatic difference. And if you're concerned about the growth of welfare for the mass of people, it would have to affect you in some sort of way. Let me talk also about this question of the maintaining of poor people, giving them money to survive rather than the dignity of a job and an income that pays them for that job. This is very, very important to me, but it seems to me a wonderful example of the socialist critique. A rational society, socialists have always said, is one in which having a decent job at a decent income is a priority for the society, a bigger priority than private profitability for capitalists. You should identify, as any society could, all the things it needs, and then put everybody to work who's an adult and who's healthy and in good mental shape, etc., producing what it is we have decided democratically is what we need. Full employment is the logical thing to do. We want the output. We want people to have a job and decent income. Let's put them together. We don't do that because capitalism holds that rational, logical objective hostage. We only put people to work if it's privately profitable. And if it isn't, we don't. And they sit there. And because they might get really upset about being marginalized and excluded, we throw some welfare at them. I agree with Professor Brooks. That's an awful failure of a solution. People don't need or want that, and the rest of the society doesn't need and want it either. And it is a stunning critique of capitalism that what nobody wants keeps happening, just like those every 4 to 7 year downturns, and nobody wants it, but our system imposes it on us. I used to say to my students at this point in a lecture, when you look at the instability of capitalism, these crazy downturns, like the one in 2008, like the one we're living through now, over and over and over again, I say to my students looking across the podium, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. And think about, why are you staying with an economic system that works this way? And finally, college for all. I love the idea. I'm a college professor. It kind of makes sense. But in our society, as we know, we don't do that. And for an enormous number of young people, we require them now to incur debts they cannot reasonably be expected to ever repay, as most of them will tell you. Struggle as they do, postpone marriage, postpone children, postpone the life they would have chosen, the career that they would have excelled in, because they've got to deal with this burden. And then you go to Germany, a country whose leader, Angela Merkel, is only the leader because of the support of the, Socialist Party in Germany for years, and they're not the only country in Europe. All tuition and all college fees are gone. Zero. All you have to do to get a college degree or an advanced degree is pay for your room and board, which you would have had to do anyway. But the schooling is free. And to drive home what the commitment there was of the socialists, who, by the way, pushed for this and got it, over the objection of the capitalists in the country, by and large, they make it available to anyone on this earth. You don't have to be a German citizen to qualify for a free college or graduate education. Let me conclude with yet another example of what socialists won. In this case, I'm going to use the example of France, just to go different from Germany. In France, once you enter the labor force, after high school or college, the law passed and pushed by socialists requires that every employer give every employee, right from the beginning, 5 weeks of paid vacation to recoup themselves, sort of like a college sabbatical. These are commitments to a balance between work and life, to a quality of life, to a dignity of the person that Americans cannot imagine under their system, let alone even yet demand. Socialism is coming here because the difference between what we are doing and what is already available has been demonstrated by socialists, and it's even more applicable to this notion of democratizing the enterprise as the number one focus of socialism in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Brooks, on to you.
Thank you, Professor Wolff, for that really eloquent response to a lot of my remarks. And what I'll do is I'll structure my comments partly with reference to your opening statement, and partly just answering some of the criticisms that you just leveled, which I think are good criticisms and they're important. And I hope I can be compelling in my response. To begin with, you talked about capitalism as almost a monolithic economic system and a variety of socialisms. That's an important construction because it's true that there isn't one socialism. And it's true that we're unsophisticated in the way that we understand socialism in this country. You presented 3 models: the failed Soviet model, the at least somewhat successful social democratic model, judged as such by the citizens of social democratic countries, and then a new model, which is largely theoretical, that you described, with largely it's an ownership or worker-based, more democratic workforce oriented model. But I would like to suggest that capitalism is not monolithic, that there are multiple capitalisms as well. And the reason is because socialism and capitalism exist on a spectrum. And so, for example, I can give you 3 different capitalisms. There's managed capitalism, which is another way of talking about social democracy. Labor markets are much freer in Denmark than they are in the United States. Denmark is always held up as the sine qua non of social democratic excellence. And yet people can be hired and fired much more easily in Copenhagen than they can in California. They're just guaranteed a $26 an hour minimum wage, last time I checked. This results in a whole and lots of nice things and as they say, as Ira Gershwin once wrote, nice work if you can get it. But it also leads to a number of problems in markets. For example, that immigrants to Denmark, for example, Arabic-speaking immigrants who are not fluent in Danish, given the fact that almost all labor markets are conducted in Danish, have something like a 73% unemployment rate because they simply cannot earn enough to merit a $26 minimum wage, in which case they are on the welfare benefits that you quite appropriately decried as that which strips people of their dignity. So social democracies, aka managed capitalism, don't do so well on that count. Another kind of capitalism is authoritarian capitalism, which is what we see in the People's Republic of China. You're quite correct that this is not the same kind of communist nor capitalist economic system, and yet is responsible for pulling not the majority, but a minority, a plurality of the souls out of poverty since 1970, specifically since 1982 with the opening of southern China. The People's Republic of China have pulled approximately 700 million people out of dollar a day poverty, adjusted for inflation, obviously, starvation level poverty. Here's the problem with that. Let's celebrate that to begin with. That's a wonderful thing. I think we all agree that that's great. But you and I, Professor Wolff, we also agree that there are significant problems with the Chinese system: repression, oppression, the idea of slave labor, which still exists. I mean, it's just the treatment of Tibet, the threatening of Taiwan, the way that people are treated who disagree with the government. Why is that? And the answer is because when I talked about the 5 forces that have pulled people out of poverty, I mentioned globalization, free trade, property rights, the rule of law, and the culture of entrepreneurship. The People's Republic of China has tried to make this shift without property rights and rule of law, without the institutions of democracy. They got as far as they could with a desperately poor population. Once desperately poor population and a growing middle class, but they're stuck in a middle income trap precisely because they haven't taken on the other parts. This is not an indictment of the 5 institutions, it's an incomplete case. And then, of course, there's corporate capitalism or cronyistic capitalism, which we see in Argentina, places all over South America and many places in the world, which stains the idea of free enterprise system, stains the idea that the free enterprise system can be a cultural instantiation of the freedom of the human spirit of an entrepreneurial culture, because it really is the privilege taking away from the people at the margins. High Gini coefficients of extreme inequality that exists precisely because of the lack of true merit, of true freedom of institutions that actually treat people in the same. Are we perfect in the United States? Absolutely not. I believe we're moving more and more toward the Argentine crony capitalist system. That's the reason I talked about the philosophical changes, the cultural changes, and the policy changes that could improve our capitalist system. Now, for your criticisms about capitalism, number one, about inequality. I'll remind us again, inequality has fallen worldwide for 35 years, and consumption inequality in the United States has stayed flat. And consumption inequality is as important as income inequality, I dare say. The inequality case that is to be made, that leveled against capitalism, I think that it's more complicated than that. And I think the data don't support the full-on attack of capitalism. I think that we, the people who believe in free enterprise, have made an inadequate case along these lines, but I'm trying to make it now. Second is the instability of capitalism. When I look at the social democratic regimes, and of late, I see the same kind of business cycle instability. I see social democracies suffered in recessions. Arguably the worst case was Iceland in the financial crisis. You could say because they fell victim to the vicissitudes of capitalism from the West. But you have to admit, I think that we all have to admit, that the Scandinavian economies, the best exemplars of social democracy, suffered a lot, certainly as much as the United States. And before that, there were recessions and depressions and famines all across the socialist or communist systems, which I realize you don't support particularly. But it's worth pointing out that the 50 million people who've died in the People's Republic of China is largely because under communism, under Maoism, there were famines that came from the business cycle or the agricultural cycle. And finally, authority. I want more authority pushed down, I agree with you, but I don't think socialism is the way to do that. I agree that it's not always fair. It feels unjust, the authority that certain citizens have over other citizens in a private sector context. But I'm a lot more worried about the arbitrary exercise of authority of governments over individuals. That, you know, when Jamie Dimon doesn't like a particular employee, he can fire that employee from JP Morgan Chase. When the means of production are owned by the government, that's a person who crosses the government can be put in jail, can be put to death. That's a kind of authority, a kind of power with which I'm even less comfortable. And certainly that is not a hyperbolic case, looking back at what happened in the Soviet Union when unemployment was literally illegal. People went to jail because they were unemployed. That's a true exercise in raw power. And I think that we could probably all agree to regret that power over our human brothers and sisters. Can we democratize the system? Can we get the things that you want? I believe that we actually can. But once again, my bottom line is that we need to expand ownership. We need to expand free enterprise. We need to expand entrepreneurship, not contract it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Brooks, and thank you both for some of the back and forth as well. In the next 35 minutes or so, I recommend we go to the questions because there are many questions. And more are coming, initially at least, we're coming to Professor Wolff, so I'll start there. And then I will ask some to Professor Wolff, and there are some that both can address. I should also say use your judgment and feel free to address any question that I pose. Okay, so first to Professor Wolff, and a lot of these had to do with workplace democracy, I guess your third point there. A question, given the myriad decisions that must be made to run an enterprise, particularly as enterprise scale increases, Professor Wolff, how can you effectively run a business by employee plebiscite?
Okay, let me respond on two levels because I can answer this question as well as comment, if it's okay, on one point that Professor Brooks made. This is in no way a purely theoretical proposal. Working places, enterprises, have been democratized in the past, they are in the present, and they are increasingly doing so as time moves on. I could give you, and I will in a minute, many, many examples. And perhaps I'll start that way. The way you organize that is the same way that you organize the political process. You can either do it with a direct democracy, as some political processes work, or you can have a representative democracy, or a variety of others. The same arguments about, gee, it's a little unwieldy, and wow, it'll take a long time, and not everybody is equally prepared. All of those apply to political democracy too, yet we've gone ahead and done it. And I doubt too many of us are regretful of that. I'm certainly not. I want to extend the democracy to include the workplace because I believe it should never have been excluded from it. I find it bizarre in a country that makes such a big deal of its commitment to democracy that it never applied that so-called value to the workplace. You know, the workplace is where most adults spend most of their time. 9 to 5, 5 out of 7 days of the week in most parts of the world. The best hours of the day you're working. Many more hours you're either recuperating from it or getting ready for it. This is a very crucial part of your life, and a democratic society really doesn't deserve the label if it excludes the workplace from the democratic commitments that it articulates. So yeah, I think there would be some difficulties. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's famous remark that the democratic government is a very sloppy, inefficient way. It's just better than all the others. And for me, the same applies. I think a democratically run enterprise would never distribute income and wealth the way capitalist enterprises have always done. I agree with Professor Brooks about the morality that ought to govern, but I think it's capitalism that is the obstacle to that morality ever being able to trump the profit motive and the collection of more and more property in the hands of fewer and fewer people, which is the reality, as Piketty, Saez, and the others have documented.
This next question to Professor Brooks follows very nicely on that last statement, Professor Wolff. Professor Brooks, capitalism has been around for more than 300 years. Why has your vision on the moral capitalism never materialized? Could you please clarify why it is preferable for all people to have equity instead of decision-making power?
I wouldn't rule out the idea that people should have decision-making power. It's true, there are workplaces that have this. I belong to one. I'm a faculty member at Harvard University, and I vote on things all the time. Now, I don't vote on my own salary because that would have all kinds of practical inefficiencies and problems, and that, you know, it would be hard, as Professor Wolff quite clearly points out. So there are cases in which this, you know, the idea of democratizing workplaces can and should work. Why is it that, you know, moral capitalism hasn't taken over? Well, because people are fallen and people are imperfect. It's the same reason that good socialism hasn't taken over. Socialism has been tried again and again and again. I mean, and it's not even, it's an obvious statement that the Soviet Union failed, that the People's Republic of China is ultimately going to, you know, is failing the human rights of people and stripping people of their human dignity, that Cuba is an economic joke. I mean, these are truisms. Now, maybe the social democratic model, aka the managed capitalism model, is the middle way that will work for a lot of places under different cultural circumstances. But the truth is that we're looking for something better, and we have to strive for it. The progress that we're trying to make has to keep in mind that neither Richard's vision nor mine is ever really going to come to pass in an unmitigated way without problems. These are projects that we're all working on such that we can create a better life for more people. what do I want? I want a society that actually does better and gets closer to this goal. I realize that sometimes it's going to succeed and sometimes it's not going to succeed. And if Richard is correct and gets his way, sometimes it's going to work and sometimes it isn't. We have to get away from this Manichaean thinking about our goal-making process in the economic systems or democratic or social systems or theologies for that matter. I mean, Manichaeanism was an actual religion that said that it's going to be all black and all white. It's going to be all good or all bad. On the contrary, let's set our sails in a particular direction and do the best that we can. And we're going to have setbacks, and let's keep fighting for this better future together. Because, by the way, that journey, that progress per se is a great moral good.
Professor Wolff, I saw you had your mic unmuted. Did you want to get into that question, or can I go to the next one?
I think it'd probably be better let more of the people
Okay.
pose their questions. Sure.
Here's one addressed to both of you, and it's about a question that I think correctly argues that there's a lot of agreement at least in these in the following area. You both mentioned openness, helping the poor in the world, improving the globe. What is the place for nations and local communities in each system? Which system offers a sense of belonging and community for people? Can capitalism help us improve the lives of the poor, not in Ethiopia, the questioner asks provocatively, but within our own community?
Richard, would you like to start?
Sure. I used to be asked the question, what in the end, what on the most basic level you can think of defines socialism across all of its variations and incompletenesses. And the answer that I've come to in my life is that socialism is the yearning for something better. And in this case, it's the yearning of people caught up in capitalism who say to themselves, my God, life could be better than what it is here. We don't have to have the homeless around us. We don't have to have the racial dilemmas that dog this country from the beginning right to this minute, as we all know. We don't have to have the inequality. We don't have to accept what we can do better. The same yearning that was in the heart of a slave or the heart of a serf, that yearning is in the heart of an employee and an enlightened employer too, who understands that we all might be better off if the system that we were trapped in here was opened up and could change. So for me, that leads me to respond to this question by saying that socialism in the first place is the commitment to do that, to not make it subject to profit. Profit is not the bottom line. Profit is not the necessary objective to which everything else is subordinated. Profit is just one of the many dimensions of any enterprise. The feeling of belonging, the feeling of solidarity, the levels of friendship among people in an enterprise, all of those, like daycare for the young parents, you can go on and make the list of the things we care about. A socialist system of the sort I'm in favor of would be the democratic determination of what the whole set of objectives are. And in that set, profit could be listed, but it would never have the dominant and, in my judgment, destructive role that it has in capitalism here and in other countries.
Richard's making a lot of sense here. The whole idea that capitalism would be the only thing that we care about, that's insane. And that's because that doesn't actually even describe the goals, the objectives of human beings. I mean, the idea that what I care about most is personally making profit or making money, the kind of rank materialism. That's, my specialization as a social scientist is the science of happiness. That's what I teach here at Harvard. And let me tell you, you want to become unhappy? Be a materialist. It's the single fastest way that you can be miserable about your life. So the key is, how do we set up a system such that people can express these tendencies with the greatest freedom and enjoy their work, and to have a sense of fraternity inside their work, to enjoy the relationships they get in their work? And the answer is a relatively free and unfettered labor market existing in a capitalist system, and in which people have opportunities to lift themselves up, in which there are pathways in which they can earn their success. And so my answer to how can we make things better inside the United States, and not just better in the developing world, is that we actually need to return to these ideas of self-improvement in the opportunity society, to create more human capital, to make people more valuable. Look, 70% of people say right now that their best friends are people they know at work. 70% of Americans say that. The United States has a higher rate of job satisfaction than virtually any of the European countries, including the social democracies. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not deluded. There might be some sort of false consciousness, but I don't think so. The problem is that not enough people have access to this kind of opportunity. Not enough people have access to this. And when you ask people, as I've done with my friends at the Gallup polling organization, why is it that you enjoy your job? The answer is never because I make money. Richard's right. It's because I actually have my friendships there, because it makes me happy to be around these people, because I'm able to, in essence, serve others and earn my success. And that's what we need to be going for. That's how we can solve this problem. And that actually is no small part of how we can create more community. Richard and I are not that far apart.
Well, if I could push back just a bit, I think when you divide people into employer and employee, which is what labor market refers to, you are already on the slippery slope to the wrong end of this game. You are, in fact, creating a subgroup in the community, the employer, who has an interest in maximizing profit because the employer is the one who gets it. And whatever the employee may want in the way of friendship or all the other values we might have as a community, the lack of democracy means that the desires of the workers does not play anything like the role of the desires of the employer. That's the only reason we maximize profits. The economics profession is designed, and I'm part of it, to teach people that by making the profit maximum, somehow the best for everybody will be achieved. That's a crazy rationalization of a fundamentally unjust arrangement. But capitalism is the problem. When we make employers and employees, we create the basis for making the profit, which is what the employers get, the thing that has to be maximized, and that subordinates what everybody else needs. You can struggle to have a friend in the workplace, but you're struggling against a system rather than having the system facilitate what it should have facilitated in the first place, which is a democratic arrangement for what all the objectives are that the enterprise experience ought to achieve.
Professor Wolff, question for you. Is socialism compatible with charity as a free, non-coerced personal gift to the less fortunate? If so, how and under what conditions, contexts, and policy?
I think it's fair to say, it's an interesting question. I think it's fair to say that socialists have always been looked askance, let me say, at charity, because of the history of charity being a way for people with wealth to feel less guilty about their fellow citizens' lack of wealth. By throwing a coin at the beggar, it's not clear who's the bigger winner of this game, the beggar with the coin or you with the relieved guilt. That we should react to charity by saying it should never be necessary. In other words, people should be given the dignity of having a job, having a contribution to make, being rewarded reasonably for doing so. Then, if there will be free will gifts among people, fine, but they will not have the aroma, or maybe I should better say the odor of the inequality that usually is the way that charity is arranged.
I'll add that attitudes about economic redistribution and collectivism are one of the greatest predictors of private charitable giving. People who say they want the government to do more to redistribute income, that they want a more socialist system in the United States, they're the least likely to give charitably, to give their time charitably, to give their money charitably, to give their blood charitably. These are just facts that we actually see in the data. Now, part of that can be because of the odor, but I dare say that there shouldn't be too much odor about blood donations. There shouldn't be that much odor about, volunteering to clean up a park, and to volunteer inside a society. And yet the idea of collectivism, it tends to do something, it seems. And, from my point of view as a behavioralist, I would say that it does something to motivation. It does something to the human spirit. It takes away the sense of agency from people as problem solvers. One of the studies that I've done a lot of work on as a researcher over the years is the happiness that actually comes from charitable behavior, which I find is the best single thing that you can do. Is my column in the Atlantic this very morning was, this is how you can buy happiness, is by helping somebody else with your money. Give away your money. The trouble is that if you reduce the idea of transfers of money only to the sort of the desiccated technocratic machine of government redressing differences that people have in their lives, you make people into cogs in that machine. And this is, of course, one of the long-standing criticisms that people have had of socialism and its inability to describe the human experience. It tends to strip people of this humanity, of voluntary help that they have of each other, of the agency that comes from indeed being your brother's keeper. I think that we don't have to make that decision. I don't think that necessarily that perhaps Richard's suggestions for a new socialist system would not create that set of incentives. But to date, the more socialism we have, the less charity that we have. And I think much to the detriment of the human soul.
I'm going to fuse a couple of questions here to Professor Wolff again, but Professor Brooks can, of course, jump in. In the capitalist system, Professor Wolff, the enterprise has a responsibility to generate revenue and profits. Jobs are created in the process. How is socialism going to create those jobs if there are no profits and no incentive?
Profit is just a number. Profit is a number in which you subtract a set of costs, by no means all the costs that are involved, a subset of the costs, and you subtract them from the revenues, and you're left with a result. It's called the profit. It is not necessarily connected to anything. Nobody seriously now, no one should imagine that having profit is a requirement for producing anything. There have been most of the history of the human race, there wasn't profit, it wasn't conceptualized, it wasn't calculated. It is a big issue of dispute what, in fact, the profit ever is, since people don't agree on what subset of costs you should subtract from revenues to get it. It is a mythology of American economics and of neoclassical economics to give this some central place, as if it had a universality of what it meant and what it was for. Human beings can very rationally sit down and decide, how much of our time do we want to spend working? And how do we want that work to be divided? What are the goods and services our work should produce for us collectively to consume? Families do that all the time. They allocate labor. Who's going to clean up what part of the yard Saturday afternoon? Nobody has to earn a profit. No calculation has to be made. All kinds of decisions have been made by human society all through history. When capitalism is gone, we will remember with a kind of amazement that people deformed themselves in order to maximize this one thing. It's as if we were looking at an ancient society which never made any decision without first having an in-depth conversation with the god of the tree. We look back and we kind of wonder about that. We see a certain artistic flair, but to take it seriously is an amazement, and we will look back on profit in the same way. Socialist societies have and will be able to solve the problem of what to produce and how to produce it and how to allocate labor without any need to calculate one of the peccadillos of neoclassical economic theory.
Question for both of you now. I wonder whether the speakers might address the issue of how IT, information technology, is transforming the socialism capitalism debate, and in particular how it allows China and China's socialism, quote unquote, now socialism with Chinese characteristics, to become, in effect, capitalist. And then the questioner emphasized, remember, Deng always emphasized market elements.
Deng Xiaoping is the reason for the alleviation of poverty of between 600 and 800 million Chinese, with the openness that actually came starting in southern China in 1982. So that's the reference that we're seeing there. The IT revolution, of course, is fundamentally democratizing and flattening the entire planet. Manufacturing of hard goods and localized services makes it a lot harder to be a truly globalized economy. But that in which we can connect to anybody, any place in the world relatively costlessly, and we have services that are not geographically bounded and are really hard to define, means that anybody can participate in the new entrepreneurial economy in a very big way. And so what that's doing, of course, is lifting up whole parts of the world. It's not just China, it's also India, which is responsible for 350 million of the people who've been pulled out of starvation level poverty since the late 1970s in that case, since the worst grips of Nehruvian socialism under the circumstances, which was really a predation. What we find is that people all over the world, and by the way, probably one of the next great revolutions, which I cheer on, is going to be the growing prosperity of communities all over Africa, which will be participating in this part of the economy. So I think that the IT revolution, which has a lot of problems to it, it's a technocratic revolution that's creating all sorts of cultural problems around the world. We don't have to rehearse that. That's a different debate. And I strongly suspect Richard and I see that in just the same way. But we do have to recognize that it's also an incredibly democratizing economic phenomenon that's going to reward ingenuity in a world that does not require natural resources, in a world that does not require transportation, in a world that does not require physical capital like plants and equipment. And I think that that's going to speed up the development process in places all over the world to the great benefit of the poor.
I would respond somewhat differently. Coming out of the socialist tradition and the Marxist tradition, we all owe a lot to a German philosopher named Hegel, who cautioned us to remember that all things are contradictory. And the IT revolution will do some things along the lines that Professor Brooks talks about, but it will also enable levels of surveillance, levels of control of production, level of control of the labor force that capitalists will capitalize on. It is not an accident that some of the grossest examples of inequality in the world today, among billionaires, for example, the new ones are coming directly out of IT-dominated industries, that they are acting like traditional monopolists, using IT to establish and protect their monopolies, and so forth and so on. I would like to also, if I may, comment on a recurring theme here where I think we do disagree, and I think it may be important to say something about this. I don't think these are truisms. Professor Brooks and I guess we disagree. I think there were things that happened in the Soviet Union that were terrible and that we have to learn never to do again. And there were other things in the Soviet Union that were spectacular and that we could and should learn from. And exactly the same in China, and exactly the same for any other place. The notion that in one case it's all a disaster strikes me as a leftover of the Cold War that we need somehow to get beyond. And I think the same thing applies to what Professor Brooks said that I agree with earlier, that there are different kinds of capitalism. I would take it further. There are different concepts of really what capitalism is. For me, as an economist, capitalism is unique and distinctive because of the employer-employee way of organizing the production of goods and services. It's distinguished from feudalism because they had something called lord and serf, or from slavery that had something called master and slave, or from self-employment where one person, in a sense, played both roles. These are the distinctive things, not enterprises that are free or state-run, because all of those systems had that. and not markets, because again, all of those systems displayed markets all over the place. This distinctive thing about capitalism is that division of the people within production, not into a democratic collective to make decisions that way, but into a dichotomized employer minority, totally dominating the employee majority. You know, we got rid of kings and subjects centuries ago, but we didn't really. They just slipped by and entered the enterprise where little fiefdoms and kingdoms of CEOs, etc., perpetuated themselves. So we still have to confront them now and shake our heads when we realize that having left the undemocratic enterprise to itself, it's terribly difficult to get a real democracy going, even in the political sphere where we have at least got the forms, which is why the socialism of the future focuses on democratizing that neglected part, which is the enterprise.
I'd make a comment about the idea that there's a nuanced cost-benefit analysis about the Soviet Union and China. I have a lot stronger opinion about that. China in China during the communist times is a direct result of economic and authoritarian government policies. 50 million of their own citizens perished. In the Soviet Union, 30 million of their own citizens perished, largely having to do with repression, starvation, labor camp deaths, gulags, the complete suppression of human rights. I think it's something that we can all agree to unilaterally regret. Now, let's get into what we would think of today as the things that we're worried about. We're quite correctly worried about environmental degradation and the policies that we have in the United States. There is no example of environmental degradation that comes even close to what happened during Soviet times in the USSR, or to China today, where there are 1 million dead pigs floating down the Yellow River, where you actually will see an entire mountain disappear under central planning policy. These are things that are unthinkable to us, even by modern standards. So I would say that it's not a nuanced cost-benefit analysis. It would be, of course, inaccurate, because anybody who tells you that anything is all benefits and no costs, or all costs and no benefits, is lying to you. But the costs of these systems are just the human cost, the environmental cost, the cost in human rights, the cost in dignity are so vast that I think we should all regret them in a very big way. Second, both of those regimes, the USSR and the PRC, started on the arguments that were pretty close to Richard's arguments about trying to run countries and companies like families. The idea that the profit motive is not necessarily is something that we have to look out for, that we can get beyond the idea, that we can run things like a community and as a commune, and that we can count on people not being selfish. I think that I wish it were true. I mean, I certainly ran a socialist organization called My Family, where it was from each according to his ability, except for my teenage kids who did not perform up to their abilities, and to each according to his needs. But the truth is, it doesn't scale. That's the problem. I wish it did. I really wish it did. It doesn't scale up. And the result is that we keep promising this. We keep being promised this, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work again. And so what we're left with is basic market systems where we shave off the worst parts, the things that we don't like, where we try to solve the market failures. And it's not perfect, but it's better. And I think that we can continue to do better.
If I could respond, because I guess we are somehow coming perhaps in a way a bit full circle, and because we've been nice to each other, maybe a little disagreement will be a good balancer. I've always been amazed at this counting the dead mechanism of social criticism. I find it strange. If I were to engage in that kind of activity, I don't, but if I were, I would start by talking about 400 or 500 years, or at least 350, of capitalist imperialism in every corner of the world. The first book I ever wrote was a history of colonialism in Kenya, in East Africa. The British arrived there in 1895, set up a colony, and proceeded to do a census. They had about 4 million people. In 1930, they did another one, and they had about 2.5 million people. My guess is, and I'm one of the few authorities on it, that they literally extinguished the lives, one way or another, of millions of people, and that's in one small country. Lord knows what a calculation would do in India or any of the other places where the British or the Germans or the French or the Portuguese did their thing as they were moving from feudalism to capitalism. Then I would add World Wars I, which had nothing to do with any socialist society, and World War II, which didn't have much to do with the Soviet Union other than being the victim of the Nazi invasion. And I would add up all those millions of people and talk about them as the responsibility or the costs of capitalism. And then I would go on and I would get other numbers. I don't know, opioid victims in the United States, the fact that this country has 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. I would go on, and I would talk about all of this as somehow arguing that we therefore don't have to pay attention to what the achievements of the United States were. That would be outrageous. I don't want to deny all those other things, and I'm sure no one does, but I think their use as some kind of a basis for a wholesale dismissal is a mistake. The most rapidly growing GDP in the 20th century was that of the Soviet Union. And the most rapidly growing GDP in this century is that of the People's Republic of China. That doesn't excuse bad things that happened in the past or that are happening now. But it is a peculiar kind of calculus. The Chinese seem to be doing something awful to Muslims in the Uyghur section. But to hear the criticism from the United States, which has just waged a 20-year war on two Muslim countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, is a bizarre mode of debate or discussion. These are complicated situations. No one is asking anyone to absolve anyone, but the counting of the dead is a strange thing to use as a basis for anything other than looking at one dimension, but it can't be used as the kind of wholesale denigration of what this was. And I won't even go into the earlier historical examples, but they are the same sort.
Professor Wolff, I'm just going to try to get one more question in at the time we have it. Maybe
Please.
We'll go a few minutes over, technically 3 minutes left, but maybe we can go a little bit over. So another area of agreement that I think we saw here today was, I think Arthur put it once this way, both of you put it in this way, both of you want to see authority, you want to push it down, go to the sort of lowest level or more basic level here. Interestingly, so capitalism and socialism are terms that both gained currency in the early 19th century, as both of you know. Later in that century as well, another term gained currency, and this has sometimes been thought of as the third way, and this is sometimes called corporatism. This other system, this other way of seeing it, corporatist solutions to various social and economic crises. What do you think? What is your position towards corporatism, Professor Wolff and Professor Brooks? Maybe we can get that question in as well.
Well, my usual reaction is to do something we don't have time to do, which is to ask people what in the world they mean by corporatism. It can be inflected towards fascism, if you like. On one hand, it can be inflected in altogether different non-right-wing directions as well. We don't have the time. My instinct is it's a distraction. For me, as I tried to suggest a few moments ago, what is distinctive about capitalism is the use of the division of the workplace into a dominant minority, the employer and his, her designates, and the vast majority, the employees. Whether you set that up as a purely contractual interaction, as in neoclassical theory and basic defenses like that, or you think of it as a family, a corporate in the sense of body, all of which is unified in some way, when you hold on to that employer-employee relationship, you are not letting go of a distinctive capitalist nature. That's why Professor Brooks and I agree in some ways about China, because in their state enterprises, like in their private enterprises, the employer-employee dichotomy is maintained as it was in the Soviet Union. And that is why the new directions of socialism are critical of these state-focused adjustments, because they want to go after that relationship. So introducing variations like corporatism is unhelpful because it distracts from that which folks like me want to focus attention on, which is the undemocratic nature of capitalist enterprises and the goal of socialism to go somewhere new and different and bring democracy finally to the workplace.
I agree with the framing of the problem that Richard brings to it. I mean, it's like I was going to say, if he had stopped after the first 90 seconds, I would have said what he said. But but of course, the follow-on is what I disagree with. Corporatism, as far as I'm concerned, is a complete negation of the opportunity society, giving power to entrenched existing organizations and their proxies. Of course, you define it how you want. Is it Argentina? Is it fascist Italy? Is it something else in between? The bottom line is that when you have most of the time when you talk about corporatism, you have a situation like you often have in France today, where the government and the representatives of unions and the representatives of the empresarios get together and kind of decide who's going to do what. That is completely antithetical, as far as I'm concerned, to competition, to an opportunity society, to a meritocracy, to excellence, to striving, to everything else in between. Because who's locked out? It's the immigrant who doesn't belong to a union. Who's locked out? It's the small business person who's trying to get in and can't, because there's no space left by the major, expansive, corpulent corporations. The people that are being under the boot of the bureaucratic society and its adjuncts in unions and large corporations. So I couldn't be a whole lot less complimentary of corporatism as it has been instantiated, or as most people would describe it.
Thank you, Professor Brooks, as well. Let me maybe invite you to wrap it up, as it were, if you wanted to have any. I know closing statement sounds awfully formal, but if you want to encapsulate or reflect on this debate, I would like to give you each an opportunity to do this now. Professor Brooks, do you want to start first?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. And I'm going to start again, where I'm going to finish where I began, which is in thanking Richard for coming to our community here, the Abigail Adams Institute, which does really fine work, and people here in the Harvard community who are probably the majority of those who are watching us today. Thank you, Richard, for your generosity and your openness, and furthermore, for your deep thinking and intellect on these matters. I find your arguments really actually quite persuasive, and we disagree on most, but we also agree on certain things, and I appreciate that very much. The main point that I want to make from any economic system, the main thing that I want, is not money, power, fame. These are idols. These are materialistic idols. I want what Joseph Schumpeter talked about. He was the godfather of, economic godfather of entrepreneurship, understood. He was an economics professor here at Harvard University. And for years, he talked about the dignity, the imagination, the adventure that actually comes from economic activity. But only when people have true opportunity, when people can earn their success, when people can find a pathway to their accomplishment. I believe that capitalism provides the best possible opportunity for that. And so ultimately, while it's not perfect, we can make it better. And my argument is never that it should be an almost religious fervor for profit per se. On the contrary, it's something much more sacred than that. It's the human striving for dignity that comes from not learning helplessness, not being helpless to the whims of either corporations or governments, but to earn one's own success. And to the extent that we can continue to live up to the promise, the capitalist promise of an entrepreneurial society, an opportunity society, where all of us watching here, all of us ambitious riffraff can do that, then dignity becomes a little bit closer. My striving is going to be to continue to improve capitalism so it lives up to its ultimate promise.
All right. Let me Let me start by picking up on a theme, but taking it in a different direction, a theme raised by Professor Brooks. I have often taught economics courses where I gave my students readings from Joseph Schumpeter. He was a very, very important intellect, and indeed his famous book on the history of economic thought is one of the greatest compendiums of our discipline ever produced. He often, in private conversation, by the way, referred to himself as a socialist, just for the footnote. One of his best students, closest to him, was another graduate of Harvard named Paul Sweezy, who also taught at Harvard in the economics department. But when McCarthyism came in the 1950s, Harvard, with a lack of courage that is a shame to it to this day, fired him. He went on to do very important work in the development of Marxian economics. Schumpeter understood, and his student Paul Sweezy, that's Sweeezy, if you want to look up his books, they understood, as I tried to say earlier, that the fundamental driver of the transition from capitalism to socialism, within which we are already engaged, is the unacceptability to a growing mass of the employee class in capitalism of this system. For too long, it has struggled to overcome poverty, and it's less able to do that now here in the United States. You can play with the statistics on a global level, but inside most capitalist countries, as the statistics will show you, inequality is growing. And the difference between what could have been done for the poor of this world over the last 150 years versus what has been done is really what ought to get your ire up. Millions upon millions of American workers, students, are laboring under conditions that make capitalism unappealing to them. That's why the polling is going where it is going. When Professor Brooks rightly said earlier that the difference in consumption hasn't been as big as the difference in income, well, we all know why, because the working class in this country became a pioneer over the last 40 years, not in crossing the prairie with wagons, but taking on more personal debt than any working class in the history of the world had ever undertaken. Drowning in mortgage debt, car debt, credit card debt, and now school debt. It's extraordinary to keep people on a level of consumption only at the price of crippling debt. The so-called American dream is fading out of reach. That will produce the interest in socialism that folks like me are eager to feed, to inform, and to work with. And let me conclude with this. I don't take a lot of pleasure in being on the downside of capitalism's history in the United States. Most of our history as a nation, we were in the ascendant period of capitalism, and that is a heady experience. And that led to mistaken notions of American exceptionalism. We're on the way down now, and that's either going to be difficult and painful or difficult, painful, and catastrophic. The British are the model. Detroit is the model regionally for what is happening to us. And for me, the discussion of socialism is in part an attempt to open the conversation so we have a peaceful and better transition to a new and better system, rather than the horrific struggle of those wedded to the old one who can't see beyond it and who are desperate to hold on. And I appreciate your invitation and this conversation as a step, hopefully, in that direction.
Thank you very much for the closing statements. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I would also like to thank now our participants who submitted excellent questions. I regret not being able to ask more of them. There was also a lively chat, which I have caught up a little bit now towards the end. And again, there were more questions there. Perhaps we will find a way to continue this conversation in some other format. Professors Brooks and Wolff, thank you very much. ISI
Thank you.
and Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, many thanks, and have a good afternoon.